Before we get into it, let's have a look at tomorrow's front pages. We're going to start with the Daily Mail, and they are running with William walk behind Queen's coffin, brought back memories of my mother's funeral. The front page of the Telegraph leads with NHS doctors and nurses to walk ahead of coffin, and Prince Harry allowed to wear uniform in vigil of the grandchildren. The Independent runs with anger at obscene plan to axe banker bonus cap, and also Roger and out, Federer to retire at 41 years of age. Friday's Guardian now leads with trust to lift fracking ban despite lack of progress on tremor risks, and a photo there of the queues to see Her Majesty lying in state, which apparently have reached up to 5 miles. Front page of the Financial Times runs with Putin admits to Chinese concerns over Ukraine. We're going to be covering that later on. And also, Truss prepares fresh bid to persuade SoftBank to list tech group Arm in UK. I have no idea what that means. Front page of the Mirror now leads with "Good night, Olivia, love you," on the tributes to Olivia Pratt-Corbell, and William's agony walking behind the coffin reminded me of my mum. Friday's Daily Express has "The Queen was like everyone's grandmother." Prince William says the emotional reaction to the Queen's death reveals how much the public loved her. And finally, Friday's Daily Star, and they run with "Pray for the poor millionaire bankers." Kwasi wants to scrap cap on bonuses. As we all struggle to pay our bills, the new Chancellor is thinking of helping fat cats. And those are your front pages. Kicking off with the Mirror now, and King Charles faces challenges at the start of his reign, Nick.
Yes, the Mirror have given him a few days' grace before pointing out his daunting task. They say Charles faces a series of daunting challenges as he begins his reign as king. And, of course, they list things like dealing with Andrew, the William and Harry saga, the general management of the Commonwealth, the perception of the cost of living crisis versus the sort of royal pomp, the modernising aspect, and living up, of course, to Her Majesty the Queen's legacy. So there's a few things worth highlighting for me. This thing about the cost of living crisis, the New York Times went with this as well, that like, oh, this is terrible because of the cost of living crisis to be doing all this. And there's a few things wrong with that. I mean, one, the cost is probably a fraction of things like the Liz Truss bailout package anyway.
Yep.
Also, it's my understanding that the Crown Estate revenue pays for this, not just directly from taxpayers' money. I could be wrong. The other thing I just note is that they talk about the Commonwealth countries that might want to remove the monarch as head of state. And this is the interesting thing where sort of lefties, particularly in America for some reason, seem to want to have a go at the Queen and talk about colonialism and all these things, whereas actually you could argue that the Queen's actually presided over the decline of the Commonwealth, and presumably Charles will continue to do the same.
Toby, what do you think? Is this quite a negative take on the new monarch, that he's going to have all these problems and this is going to be a really difficult reign for Charles?
Yeah, well, it does seem like quite a pessimistic take. And so far, you know, he seems to have not put a foot wrong. And one risk it highlights is that, you know, he tends to stick his oar in where it's not really wanted.
Yes.
Political matters.
Well, that's his reputation, isn't it?
That's his reputation, slightly interfering, oversteps the brief a little bit.
Yeah.
But he hasn't done that so far, and he said he's going to put that stuff aside. So I think I'm a little bit more optimistic than this piece.
Well, I mean, particularly when it comes to issues such as climate change, where he has been very vocal, and of course, in that sense, you know, he has a disadvantage over the Queen because, of course, she was always kept herself to herself. But we've always known her as Queen. And Charles, of course, we've had many, many decades to know exactly what he thinks about various political issues.
Yeah, so that's a slight disadvantage. And I think he chose that as an issue because he thought it was not particularly politically contentious. All the major political parties agree on net zero. Now that people are the Conservatives are beginning to depart a little from that consensus, I think he needs to leave it alone for fear of getting involved in controversy.
I mean, Nick mentioned the cost of living crisis. And really, isn't this article sort of flagging that actually part of the challenge that he faces is that there's going to be a growing resentment, isn't there, in the country of very rich people who are very obviously very wealthy. But maybe people should be reserving that for the CEOs of the energy companies and that kind of thing, and not really... I mean, will it be the case that they will resent the royals in this regard?
I think people who are already prone to being Republicans will use this as a new thing to make their case. I question whether patriots who love the Queen and believe in the royal family will suddenly be annoyed at the cost. It will basically be whatever your side of the fence you're on, you'll use it, much like the Mirror are using it here because they're lefties. And the other thing they mention is the challenge of keeping the monarchy relevant in the 21st century. I'd rather it go the other way, in the 21st century go back to being.
You
in
want it to
line
be
with
more
the
traditional.
Yeah,
More,
let's go, because they want to. It's all the monarchy's got to modernise. No, why doesn't society go back a bit?
You mean like he should be beheading wives and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I see. What do you think, Toby?
Well, one thing, in the section on reuniting his warring family, in which he talks about, the article talks about having to somehow breach the divide between Charles and Harry, between Harry and William, and it mentions Meghan's allegation that a member of the royal family had asked how dark her and Harry's first child would be, and that was apparently evidence that there was a racist member of the royal family. I recently saw Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle at the O2, and Chris Rock had a good bit about that, in which he said he didn't know a single black family with children that hadn't at some point speculated when the wife was pregnant as to what the colour of the baby's skin was going to be. He said black people speculate about that all the time, and when she said this and thought it was evidence of racism, that to him meant that was evidence she didn't have a single black friend, didn't have any black people
But
at
then,
all.
on the other hand, the royal family aren't black. So is it? It's slightly different, then, isn't it? Black families speculating.
Well, but he thought if she'd have known any black people, she'd have known that speculating about the baby's colour was not evidence of racism.
But is it even his role to unite Harry and William? I mean, isn't that something that should be left to themselves, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think the royal family is doing a reasonable job of putting on a united front. And, they've offered these royal titles. I think we're going to get to that in a bit, to the two children of Harry and Meghan. So, they haven't got, I don't think, much to complain about.
No. Well, we will be getting on to that in a moment, because we've got to move on to Friday's Times now. They have a story about extreme forward planning, 20 years to be precise. Toby.
Yes, so the 18th Duke of Norfolk, Earl Marshal of England, is the man responsible for organising the Queen's lying in state and the state funeral.
What a task!
And it's a tough job, but his ancestors have held the post continuously since 1672. So he's had a certain amount of preparation, and apparently his predecessor, his father Miles, his father, so the current occupant's grandfather, said it should be a piece of cake because he had to organise the crossing of the Rhine in the Second World War in 24 hours. So organising the Queen's funeral will be a piece of cake, according to his granddad.
But it's clearly not a piece of cake, and this has been such a sort of massive operation. The military have obviously had to be involved. This has been absolutely huge, Nick.
Yeah, well, you start to realise how much these things are planned. I think I mentioned the other day, I was watching that film from 2006, and they talk about the Operation Tay Bridge, which was the Queen Mother's, the plan for the Queen Mother's funeral, and her being a bit irked that the Diana funeral was using the same model because they had to use some sort of operational model.
Yes.
And so you realise how much. And I, as someone who recently got 91% conscientiousness on a personality test, I love the attention to detail that goes into it. And I also love that what's his name? Is it Edward Fitzgerald Howard? He's the Earl Marshal, isn't he?
Yes.
I love that he said, I'm determined not to charge the state a penny for my work as Earl Marshal. I mean, he did all this huge amount of preparation, and he, on principle, won't charge for it, which I think is great.
I mean, even the plans for Westminster Hall, I mean, this has been incredibly complicated because of these 5-mile queues. Apparently, they're reaching 5 mile at the moment. People are saying it's a 9-hour queue. What do you think about this, Toby? And did you hear, by the way, that MPs are getting to jump the quue?
I did hear that.
And
not only
that,
them, but their staff too. They each get like 3
They get
additional
4 tickets.
+3s.
Yeah, they get +4s.
I can see why if I'd been standing in the queue for 9 hours, I might resent that. No, but one of the things the Earl Marshal has done is to plan for an extra day for the Queen to lie in state. Which allows, he says, an additional 85,000 people to file past the coffin.
Well, that is forward-thinking. Very interesting. We're going to move on now to another article from Friday's Times. Looks like people are struggling to live in the moment.
Yeah,
Nick.
the Times have gone with short shrift for mourners who blocked view with their phones, and then a quote goes, "Put your phones down, watch it later. The king's about to pass. Put them down." And this was a man called Scott Peep, who was just sick of people filming the thing and also live streaming the procession while it's happening. And he said all he could hear was people live streaming it on their phones while they're actually there.
You don't need to do that. It's on every news channel.
It's on, and it's also, you're there.
Well, more importantly, you're there.
It's in reality.
Yeah.
And it says here that, but some people agreed with him and others didn't. It says most people ignored him. Someone called him miserable. They can do whatever they like, someone else protested. Others complained that all they could hear was him complaining. So there's another sort of meta level there. There's people streaming the event while they're there, complaining about the complaint. complaints about that.
And then probably seeing that covered on the live TV streams on their phone.
Yeah.
But I actually sympathise with Scott Pepe, the guy who is quoted in this piece, and apparently it all kicked off around him because he was complaining.
Yeah.
My kids won't go with me to the cinema now because if someone gets out their phone in the middle of a film being shown, I will literally start shouting at them.
As you should.
And, as I think you should.
Yeah.
Absolutely. My
Yeah.
kids are so embarrassed. Like, Dad, shut up!
Well, I mean, this is just something about the modern world now, isn't it? And I've always had this bugbear about live concerts, people holding their phone. And it's right in front of you. Just enjoy what you're seeing. Particularly when I saw the Mona Lisa at the Louvre, and you couldn't get close because people were holding their phones up. It's like, it's there.
Yeah.
It's right there.
You know what else is quite interesting? I was speaking to a taxi driver tonight who used to be a royal photographer. And he pointed out the other thing is that business has dried up because everyone's got their phones out and taking a photo of everything.
Yes.
So the royal photography business is not what it was. And he says most of the people, you know, red carpet events and so on now are not making a living. Only 2 or 3
Yes,
that
of
are making
course.
a living.
Does it suggest something that, I mean, this might be a bit cynical of me, but the people who are obviously queuing up and wanting and going to see the procession, that actually what they're more interested in is showing other people that they've been there? You know, sort of signalling that they were there and they were, you know, posting that on social media.
It's almost like outsourcing memory, isn't it? It's like saying they don't trust their brains to be able to create something that they can kind of recall in later life. They have to have it, you know, on their phones.
Or they have to get likes for the things that they're doing. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm being a bit unfair.
The only danger there, Andy, is that you're in danger of sounding like this Stephen Riker in The Guardian, former member, I believe, of Independent Sage, and he had this headline: "I'm an expert in crowd behaviour, and I believe not everyone queuing in London is mourning the Queen." And it was this very annoying article about how they're not really there because of the Queen. And there was little Republican dog whistles, I suppose you could call them, and it was.
Well, I apologise for sending any inadvertent dog whistles. That wasn't my intention there. But I am interested in this idea that people can't live in the moment. You know, I just think just put your phones away. You know, it's an important moment for a lot of people, and it's there in front of you.
Do you think it's a generational divide?
I think
people of our age, you know.
I know there are lots of people of my age do this.
Our age?
Unfortunately. Anyway, let's move on. The Times again. The King finally getting some rest, so he took a day off, Toby.
Yeah, it's been described as a private day of reflection because he's taking a day off before the funeral. But I think that's, you know, it's as though they have to kind of invent this kind of very dignified and respectable reason for him to take a day off. I mean, he's been crisscrossing the United Kingdom. He's been to Edinburgh twice. He's been to Belfast. I mean, he's entitled to, you know, if they said he put his feet up and was watching The Great Escape and had ordered, you know, takeout, that would be fine. Why do they have to present it as a private day of reflection?
I mean surely it's obvious to everyone that it's not just deserved, but absolutely necessary. You know, he found out that his mother was seriously ill, then his mother dies, and then he's the king, and he has to go out and perform public duties. I mean, he won't have had any time to process. And the death of a mother is, of course, incredibly serious in anyone's life.
He's certainly earned it. I mean, he's travelled a huge amount of distance. He's had to, like you say, do so many speeches.
Yeah.
There's so much signing of documents. He's had to meet Nicola Sturgeon, which is never easy. and I think he has impressed people as well. I mean, when we saw that guard fainting, I mean, guards are fainting. So imagine how it is if you're the king's age.
There's also something about this stoicism of the royal family. You know, he was out there meeting people as the new monarch, and it's reminiscent to me of when Princess Diana died, and her sons went out rather quickly to meet people, and they had to put on this brave face, and they were, what, 12? And, you know, really, it's something about that family that they cultivate this idea that actually we've got to get out there and get back to our duty.
Or the ones we like do, and I think that's what's impressed people immediately about Charles, that he has taken on that duty.
Yes.
Whereas we see, obviously, others haven't.
It is impressive. I can't think who you're alluding to there, Nick. Anyway,
Give him a break.
Going to move on to Friday's Telegraph now, and key workers to play a key role in the Queen's state funeral. Nick?
Yeah, it's interesting. NHS staff to walk in front of Queen's coffin at state funeral, and its doctors and nurses will form part of the procession in recognition of their work during the pandemic and beyond. And what's interesting about that is that we've moved to sort of we sort of worship the NHS during COVID, but now this is almost literally that. I mean, we worship the royal family, but now the NHS have become part of that. So in a way, of course, I don't want to be misanthropic. Of course, they've done great work. At the same time, I do find it odd that they are being elevated to that level.
Toby, do you disagree?
You know, I share Nick's reservations about the elevation of the NHS to kind of national treasure status. I mean, it's almost like, you know, you're reminded a bit of the Olympic closing ceremony directed by Danny Boyle, in which, it all climaxed with the creation of the NHS as Britain's greatest achievement. And, I slightly worry that if the crowds burst into spontaneous applause as the NHS kind of lead the mourners, people are going to... The NHS workers will just think that's for them. That's got nothing to do with...
But do you really... I mean, there is a case to be made, isn't it? That they are incredibly hard-working. I don't think we can take that away from them. It's not... they, in a sense, particularly given the...
Would you apply that to GPs?
Not necessarily. No. But is this necessarily GPs? I think this is nurses and people at frontline emergency staff, isn't it, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Can I add one irony, though, which is that really, unfortunately, we almost covered it the other night, and I didn't mention it, is that due to the Queen's funeral, they actually are cancelling NHS appointments. So there was a story about a 90-year-old cancer patient, an old lady who had an appointment cancelled because of that. And we can all argue about which things should be cancelled due to the Queen's funeral, sports events and so on, and football, or due to the general mourning period. So I think it's a bit strange that the NHS are cancelling crucial appointments.
Just quickly on that, Toby, do you think that we should be cancelling everything? I mean, there was the discussion about the pubs. We had a discussion about the pubs yesterday, and for some people, that's their way of celebrating, to go out and watch the funeral in a pub where they can have a big screen, they can talk to their friends and have a drink,
Yeah, I think the problem, as you say, Andrew, with all this cancelling of pubs and sporting events and the rest of it, is that people don't have an opportunity to kind of mourn collectively, en masse, which people like, I think. That makes it more meaningful and more memorable. I mean, I really didn't like the fact that QPR Huddersfield was cancelled last Saturday, and not for purely selfish reasons. I liked the idea of taking my 4 kids to that game where we'd observe a minute's silence, spontaneously burst into a rendition of God Save the King, the players and the officials will be in black armbands. It would be a way for my kids to fix the moment, the historic moment, in their minds.
And surely Queen's Park Rangers is the perfect way to do it.
Well, I actually did once talk to, this has come as a surprise, but I talked to a guy who'd been to the races with the Queen, and at around 4:45, 4:50, a lady in waiting came and started whispering something into her ear which sounded suspiciously like the football results. He said, "Ma'am, was that the football results?" And she said, yes, it was, as a matter of fact. And he said, "Oh, can I ask which team you support?" And she said, "Queen's Park Rangers."
So she was a fan of Queen's Park Rangers?
Apparently she's a fan of QPR, yeah.
But you would be, wouldn't you, if they're called Queen's Park Rangers?
Is it okay to do an impression of the Queen in this?
Well, I mean, you've done it now, Toby. Anyway...
Not for us, probably. Maybe.
We're going to move on to The Telegraph and travel plans on the day of the Queen's funerals. They might face disruption. Well, I mean, this is inevitable, isn't it, I think, Toby? The British Airways cancelling 1 in 7 flights. That seems like a lot.
Yeah, well... apparently, British Airways operates around 700 flights a day, so there'll still be 600 flights.
Yes.
But they're going to cancel flights between 11:40 and 12:10 to ensure the 2-minute silence at the end of the funeral service isn't interrupted, and arrivals between 1:45 and 2:20 p.m. Are going to be suspended to support the procession of Her Majesty's hearse. But
so it's just a noise issue.
Yeah, I'm slightly concerned because we recently bought quite a small dog and it's very noisy, and I've just got to remember not to let it out into the garden when we're supposed to be observing 2 minutes. So the neighbours are going to be absolutely furious.
No, you do have to be careful of that. Nick, what do you make of that? I suppose it's disappointing for those who'd booked their flights and there was no way of knowing this was going to happen. But on the other hand, you can't really have planes flying over the funeral, can you?
That's it. I mean, I am in favour of the maximum possible respect for the Queen. I think everyone knows by now I'm very respectful of the Queen, but yeah, the question is, can you really achieve total silence in 2022? I mean, it says here, we've reduced our schedule to ensure the skies are quiet at certain moments. Yeah. And I just wonder, I mean, certainly where I live, there's never a moment's silence. I wish there was, but it's very hard to achieve.
Yeah. And what if there's a thunderstorm?
Right.
Yeah. OK, well, we're going to move on now to The Telegraph, which also brings us a story about a controversial invitation to the funeral from the Far East. Nick, this is the invitations to the various nation-states seems quite political. A lot of the decisions are quite politicised, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, this is Ian Duncan-Smith, who's attacked Project Kowtow as China's Xi is invited to Queen Elizabeth's funeral. So now, the head of state of all countries with which the UK has full diplomatic relations have been invited to the funeral, except, of course, for Russia, Belarus and Myanmar. We covered this a little bit last night. And it is a complicated one because China, in general, it highlights the complicated position with China, which is that we have to trade with them, but their human rights record and so on is appalling, the way they treat their citizens. So we're constantly dealing with this.
Well, this is nothing new. I mean, we've invited the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia over here and welcomed him, and obviously his human rights abuses are not particularly good. Last night we were talking about the, obviously, Russia, Myanmar, Iran, I believe, are not
Well, there's different levels, isn't there? We were talking about Venezuela and Afghanistan were banned, and then North Korea are slightly less banned.
I think Iran has an ambassadorial presence or something like
which was strange. And so it's how do you decide? I mean, in general, what is your attitude towards China? Sunak was softer on China. Truss was a bit tougher. Trump and particularly Steve Bannon have been incredibly tough on China.
Yes.
They think it's the main threat. Then again, Trump did do, open diplomatic relations with North Korea.
Yeah.
So how do you draw the line?
Well, I mean, apparently, North Korea and South Korea have both been invited as well. So, I mean, what do you think, Toby? Is there? Is this too? Are we thinking too politically about this sort of stuff?
Well, I can see it might get a bit tricky if you've got to accommodate the North Korean ambassador and the president of South Korea,
yes,
in the same room.
Yes.
Who are you going to put between them? I thought maybe Jimmy Carter. He did, after all, negotiate the Camp David agreement. He is 97. I mean, he is a former president of the US. I don't know whether he's coming or not. But
you should do the seating plan, Toby.
It's going to be. Apparently, they only have 72 hours to do the seating plan because people don't have to RSVP until today.
Well, the next story is actually from the Express. This is about the seating plan. This one.
Yeah, and interestingly, there's a slight clash between the previous story, which Nick just did, in which says that the only countries which haven't been invited are Russia, Belarus and Myanmar. In this story, it says the notable few countries that haven't been invited are Russia, Syria and Afghanistan. So it's slightly unclear as to who hasn't been invited.
It depends which level of function you're talking about. This is the thing we talked about yesterday. Some have ambassadorial level, there's other levels.
Yes. Well, all of it feels a little bit like a distraction from what is actually, at the end of the day, a large family funeral, I suppose. Anyway, Friday's Mirror now, and Princess Anne showing her softer side, apparently, Nick.
Yeah, well, I think we're all becoming massive Princess Anne fans. As I've said before, she did 387 official engagements in 2021. Absolutely incredible. And I think this refers to, there was a video, I'm not sure if it's the exact same video. I saw a video earlier of someone was giving out flowers, and Princess Anne was there. She said, well, they're not for me, are they? And then a little girl did actually hand her some flowers for her. So it was a very touching moment. And I think Princess Anne is emerging as everyone's favourite. I'm not going to recount the kidnap story for a third time this week, but she did resist a kidnapping attempt with great panache in 1974.
Yes.
And she really epitomises the opposite of the narcissism of some royals we won't mention. And she really represents the duty and the old values.
So this is important, isn't it? Because, Toby, we've been talking on this channel a lot about the way in which the Queen represented continuity to the past, but not just in terms of, her living through the war and that kind of thing, but also values that we feel are slightly in danger of depleting.
Yes.
And Princess Anne feels like part of that continuity, actually.
Yeah, she seems to embody those values better than any other member of the royal family, possibly including our present king. And I think it's fitting that she was selected by the Queen to accompany her on her final journey, though that may be because if she'd selected one of her sons, the other two might have got a bit jealous, whereas she's only got one daughter, so it was less controversial. But I'm a huge fan of Princess Anne's, have been for a long time. I don't think she's just emerging as hasn't she long been the public favourite?
She's been particularly praised this week in the way that she's...
But this is actually, so I was slightly wrong about this. This is her comforting grieving children. It's perhaps a slightly different story, but it's about the softer side of Anne now coming out. Now, will we get to see more of her on a sort of personal level now?
Well, it's interesting because the next story is also related to this, and this is in Friday's Daily Mail. Princess Anne is not going to be a stand-in monarch for Charles in the way he was for his mother. So, Toby, this is to do with protocol, isn't it?
Yes, so this is a story which has been attracting some attention this week about the fact that Princess Anne is not going to be a Councillor of State, which is an honorary title bestowed upon those members of the royal family that can stand in for
but Prince Andrew can, and Prince Harry can.
Prince Andrew and Prince Harry can, as can Camilla, as can Princess Beatrice.
Right.
And the reason Anne isn't automatically going to be a Councillor of State is because of what's known as male royal primogeniture, whereby men get priority over
Is it
daughters.
the case, Toby, that could be revised? I know traditions within the royal family aren't easy to amend, but there seems to be a lot of clamour for that.
It can be, but only through... only Parliament has the power to change the Regency Act 1937, which set out the protocol for the appointment of Councillors of State.
Would it be appropriate at any moment in the future, Nick, for Prince Andrew or indeed Prince Harry to stand in for the monarch? I mean, how would that look?
Well, that
globally?
seems very strange, doesn't it? Because, and that's why I'm torn on this story, because much like Princess Anne, I value tradition. And since she valued tradition so much, in a way, the most fitting thing is to not allow her this, because that's in keeping with tradition. And it'll sound like an odd argument. But when you see the people that do act as Councillor of State, like you say, Prince Andrew, Camilla, you know, Queen Consort, and now Camilla, you start to think, yes, surely Princess Anne should take priority over those. So it's very, I'm torn.
She's also one of the most hard-working. I mean, in this article, it actually lists the number of royal engagements last year. Princess Anne is number one. She's actually picked the post to Charles.
387. Yeah. This is my big stat. Yeah.
So the
Charles
thing
only
is,
did 385.
Yeah. I like that they're doing sort of ranks now of, you know, sort of like a top of the pops of who's the hardest working royal. But
yeah, I mean, I think Parliament probably should amend the Regency Act. To allow Anne to become a Councillor of State. But I think if they do that, they should slip in a clause allowing William Rees-Mogg to step in if no one else is available.
Oh, really?
I was going to say
that, very well.
That's pretty woke from you, Toby. But, yeah.
Well, let's move on now. Turning away from the Queen now just for a while. Some of the other stories that are coming up in the papers. We have Friday's Telegraph, which has a story on Chinese questions on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Nick, this is very interesting.
Yeah, they've gone with the image that says everything about China-Russia divide over Ukraine. I don't know if we literally have the image.
We should have the image, which will be up there in a moment.
Okay.
But what is this
Well, it's actually
about?
been described as being at either side of a massive table, and the Telegraph actually uses the word massive. So they were sat either side of a huge table.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Having a kind of... There it is. I mean, Putin always does that, to be fair. But
it's kind of odd because the centrepiece is a coffin.
Yes, I mean, that is a bit creepy, actually. So, I mean, is it... Go on, sorry, Nick.
Well, I was just going to explain that it's about the kind of diplomatic tensions between China and Russia, because China has obviously witnessed Russia's invasion and thought, this is a bit reckless, this isn't going that well,
yes.
It's incredibly unpopular. There were fears that they would now be emboldened to invade Taiwan, but instead they've looked at it and gone, how much do we want to align ourselves with Russia?
I mean, China have been quite muted, actually, over from the start. You know.
To put it in Star Wars terms, Andrew, basically, Russia is Darth Vader and China are the Emperor. You know, you think Russia's the main evil and the main threat, but actually it's the more subtle threat of the Emperor. And what's happened is China has said, do we actually want to be part of that? So I'll give you an example. They've said things like China is willing to work with Russia to demonstrate its responsibility as a major country, but they also say they agree that they want a fairer and more equitable international order, which is China and Russia's way of saying we want to take over. But at the same time, they've been basically, there's just hints that China are sort of edging away and saying, we're going to wait and see how this one plays out.
To what extent, Toby, do you think that the events of the last few days and this huge turnaround between Ukraine and Russia will have, as Nick implies, put China off their imperial ambitions with Taiwan?
I'm not sure that China will be too deterred from...
Well, they've said they want to be in there by 2025, haven't they?
Yes, and, I think it's one thing resisting Russia's invasion if you're in Ukraine. I think, it's harder to imagine Taiwan putting up quite such a strong battle. And
well, I mean, of course, but then the US has pledged to support them in that given situation. I mean, is it likely?
I suppose it partly depends who the president is. When and if China invades. I mean, I hope China's been put off from invading Taiwan by what's happened to Putin in Ukraine, but I think it's a very different balance of power there.
Is it more just they're put off by the sort of crass way Russia's gone about it, whereas China are busy sort of building their empire in Africa and in South America and all these financial routes they have everywhere? Maybe they just think Russia's gone about it in a too obvious and crass a way. Yeah,
I mean, but it is a different case, isn't it? I mean, we are so dependent on China for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. The West more generally. This is if something were to happen, there isn't much we could do about it.
Well, it would be harder, I think, to impose sanctions on China in the same way that we've sanctioned Russia.
Exactly.
As you say, our economies are so dependent on China.
But the US is legally required to step in, isn't it, if China invades Taiwan?
OK, well, we're going to move on now to the Times. Now, this is a fascinating story. The politics of Sweden has completely changed in the last few days. And did anyone see this coming? Toby?
No, this is a real surprise. So the big story is that Magdalena Andersson, the Swedish Prime Minister, resigned, or is about to resign, and conceded defeat in last weekend's election. And it looks like the centre-right parties have done just fractionally better than the centre-left parties. So,
and the effect, it means that we have a right-wing coalition now in Sweden.
We have a right-wing coalition in Sweden, and we have we're going to have a right-of-centre Prime Minister. And the really dramatic news is that the Sweden Democrats, who until now have been kind of like the UKIP of Sweden, a very small right-wing party who people accuse of being racist and xenophobic and make a big noise about immigration and crime, have done surprisingly well. And they're now the second largest bloc.
To what extent is that accurate? I'm asking because I don't know. This article talks about how the origins of that party are neo-Nazi. They have neo-Nazi roots. Yeah, so that strikes me as a step beyond a UKIP. A closer comparison might be the BNP.
Well, I think they've moved away from their far-right origins and have become much more respectable.
So in the way that Marine Le Pen has changed the Front National.
I think that's probably a more accurate analogy, yes.
OK, I understand. What do you think of this, Nick? Because it was a surprise, but then at the same time, is it that much of a surprise? Because there have been certain issues that, shall we say, have been neglected by the Swedish government.
Yes, and in that sense, it's been going for a long time. And I read a long Twitter thread on this the other day. Perhaps I won't quote the stats in case we can't source them, but the stats on certain crimes to do with immigrants in Sweden, let's say, are absolutely shocking. So we're at the point now where, for many years, people have sort of been called racist if they mention immigration. But we're at the point where now it has to be addressed because the Prime Minister's resigning and admitting that it's been a failure and talking about the emergence of these parallel societies. And she did find a way to still imply that it was somehow Sweden's fault with this bizarre quote where she said, society has been too weak, as if somehow Swedish society is too weak to incorporate any kind of culture from around the world. But obviously the whole thing is it just doesn't work.
But there has been a correlation between the gang violence and the bombs, grenades and etc. with the ghettos that have had the immigrant communities within them. And that's not a racist thing to observe. This is true, isn't it?
No, I think it's true, and that's the reason the Sweden Democrats have done so well, I think, in this election. I mean, the big issues for them were gang violence, immigration, these parallel communities seemingly sitting outside Swedish society and ignoring Swedish laws and Swedish tradition, Swedish culture. There was a fatal shooting amidst some gang violence recently, in which an innocent bystander was caught in the crossfire, including one case with a young mother and her 5-year-old son. So it was a bigger issue in the election than the economy and the cost of living was.
I mean, this is fascinating to me. So I did contact a Swedish friend of mine who's left-leaning, would never vote for the right and didn't vote for the right. But he says people are horrified. People who are horrified now have done nothing about shootings, honour killings, kids getting robbed. We've had big Middle Eastern clan fighting in the streets, between 50 and 70 people kicking each other in the head. And the progressive woke people just pretend it's business as usual. He says, of course, I hate populism and right-wing parties, but no one else dares to tackle reality, hence the result.
Well, I think it's an argument that people like you and me have been making for a long time, rather than demonise politicians and political parties who raise the alarm about gang violence, immigrant crime and so forth. Let's have a conversation about it. But by demonising them and trying to push them outside, polite discourse, you just end up fueling these far-right parties.
Friday's Telegraph now brings us an insight into the Department of Health's take on grammar, Nick.
Yeah, Theresa Coffey tells health workers to stop using Oxford comma. So this is Theresa Coffey acting in her new role as Jacob Rees-Mogg. She's essentially tried to ban the Oxford comma. Now, if you're not sure what that is, that's, of course, where you have a list of 3 things. You say one thing, comma, another thing, comma, and then the third. And it's not strictly necessary. In fact, when I was younger, I didn't use the Oxford comma. I used to just go without it. Now, as I get older, I decided aesthetically I do prefer it.
Really?
Yeah, I've decided I do, but I think it's... Well, my theory on that, Toby, is as one of our nation's great writers, I get to just decide what kind of... But then again, so are you,
when I
and so is Andrew.
edited a piece by you recently, I think I might have taken out a couple of Oxford commas.
How dare you? You don't like them?
Can I just to clarify for people who are watching may not know, so the Oxford comma is the last comma that you put in a sentence. And to give an example that I just found online as an example of this, right? Yeah. So if you use the phrase, I live with my parents, comma, cat, comma, and dog, that makes sense. But if you took the Oxford comma out and said, I live with my parents, comma, cat and dog, it sounds like you're saying your parents are the cat and the dog. So actually clarity is important when it comes to
that's why I like it.
I think that's an unusual example. Also, to call it the Oxford comma is slightly misleading. That suggests it's a kind of traditional British practice, which has kind of fallen from use. But actually, it's an American practice, and traditionally, we haven't used that comma before the word
it is
and.
technically grammatically incorrect, but it's considered, optional. People do still use it. But isn't it the case that when Jacob Rees-Mogg, for instance, issued his guidelines in the House about what could be, and he said no to the Oxford comma, it was sort of tongue-in-cheek. He was kind of sending himself up for
hard to tell with Jacob,
he's talking about the way in which he's quite a pedant. And so he was making a joke at his own expense. Isn't Therese Coffey just doing the same?
I don't know. I mean, the more I see of Therese Coffey, the more I like her. I love that picture of her, with the glass of whiskey and the cigar,
smoking,
she just seems like a great
like
lover of life,
fun.
a jolly person. When I first started working for Vanity Fair in 1995, I remember being presented with a list of banned words that the then editor-in-chief, Graydon Carter, just thought were completely unacceptable. And so, of course, the first thing I did was to compose a story using as many of those banned words as possible, and he didn't have a sense of humour about it at all.
Well, you're a contrarian, aren't you? That's you all over. All right, Nick, what do you think?
I was just going to add one thing, which is, in a way, I'm not the person to comment, because grammar was banned when I grew up. All these ridiculous modernising reforms they do to education. When I went to school, sort of terrible comprehensive, and at the primary level, they just took away grammar. So I never actually got comfortable with verbs, adjectives and nouns, and then John Major had to bring them back with the Back to Basics campaign.
Well, your ignorance of grammar and syntax would explain your love of the Oxford comma.
Exactly.
Oh, there we
That's
go.
why I've admitted I'm not the right person, because it was taken away from me by the state school.
No, I think blame the system, because it's so important for kids to learn grammar. I mean, I speak as an ex-English teacher, so I would say that.
I never felt comfortable with
Michael Gove brought back the SPAG test, the spelling and grammar test, for all 11-year-olds, and hopefully, the next generation should be a bit better.
They should bring back Latin.
Bring
back Latin as well. I mean, that would really help people in their construction of sentences.
Absolutely.
Why not? Anyway, look, I'm sounding really reactionary, aren't I now? Anyway, let's move on.
Which time with me?
Sticking with the Telegraph, and even top brands are being affected by the cost of living crisis. Toby, what's this?
Yeah, so Louis Vuitton, the owner of LVMH, is preparing to slash his company's energy bill this winter by turning down the thermostat in his shops and urging staff to take the stairs instead of getting a lift. So temperatures in his stores are going to be reduced by 1 degree centigrade this winter, and over 30,000 staff are going to have to change their daily habits. And lights in all Louis Vuitton shops will be switched off between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. instead of being left on.
They're leaving these lights on during the night so that people who are walking down the street will see items that they might want to buy. So they're going to lose out. On the other hand, if you make the shops a bit colder, they're going to buy more coats, aren't they? Is that the idea, Nick?
It's a bit odd, this one, isn't it? Because you have for some reason you feel like Louis Vuitton shouldn't be doing this because they're a luxury brand, and you sort of imagine staff there with 3 Louis Vuitton bags that they've got, but just sitting freezing in the cold, and the only good thing they have is the bag, but they can't afford to heat their,
But it's
offices.
only 1 degree that they're actually changing the temperature of the store. Yeah. It doesn't seem all that much. And I imagine the people who shop at Louis Vuitton aren't the ones that are going to be particularly troubled by the cost of living crisis, to be honest.
It does feel a bit like virtue signalling, doesn't it? It's hard to imagine what lowering the temperature in the stores by 1 degree centigrade and forcing people to take the lift instead of this. It's hard to imagine that making much of a dent in the energy crisis.
Maybe it's an advertising thing. I mean, we're all talking about it now. We've mentioned Louis Vuitton about 5 or 6 times now. And
free advertising.
And it shows how conscientious they are, and people are going to think, oh, I'll go and buy their stuff.
Yeah, we've probably breached all kinds of regulations with that.
No, I think it's OK, because it's in the news.
Product placement, that one.
No, it's not product placement, it's in the news. Although I do like a bit of Louis Vuitton. Anyway, let's move on. Friday's Mail, and the government are to reveal an emergency budget in the coming days, Nick.
Yep, Kwasi Kwarteng will unveil emergency budget for tax cuts next Friday after the Queen's State funeral. And this is to be delivered September 23rd, when the Commons had been due to be in recess. And they're describing it as a fiscal event, which I always find ominous. But he will also confirm whether the cap on bankers' bonuses is to be scrapped, which is sort of quite controversial. And the big news is that the Liberal Democrats have cancelled their party conference, which is how many of us found out the Liberal Democrats still exist. Because they're cancelling their conference, whereas Labour and Conservatives will go ahead with their conferences, but they'll be more low-key than normal, because they're normally extremely high-key, aren't they?
They're normally one non-stop party.
So no champagne in the evening, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm actually going to the Conservative Party conference for a couple of days, so I can report back on just how subdued it is.
I might see you there.
That's right. I think we're going to be at one of the same event. I think
we are at the same event.
On stage, in fact,
I'm the only one not invited, and I'm the only Conservative here. What irony is that?
Toby, you're a bit of a conservative, aren't you?
Yeah, no, I'm
I
actually
count
a member of the
Toby as a
party,
kind
yeah.
of a London lib.
Oh, I see. I don't think he identifies that way. So, Toby, do you have any thoughts about this emergency budget for tax cuts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all knew this was coming, didn't we? I mean, he's doing something which is quite controversial, which is he's going to make it possible for city fat cats, no more caps on their annual bonuses.
Yeah,
they'll be able to get
do you think
an
that's...
unlimited annual bonus, and that's apparently to make the City of London more competitive, not lose their top talent to kind of firms in Paris. And
how's that going to go down with the people who are struggling to pay their bills?
I think that may be quite controversial, but it's quite bold, and he is proving to be so far quite a bold chancellor. He sacked his permanent secretary. That was one of the first things he did in the Treasury. That was very controversial, and now he's about to lift this cap on city bonuses.
Yeah.
So who knows what's next?
Well, I mean, it's very odd, isn't it? And we've heard Liz Truss. She sounds a bit like a Conservative, which has been a bit of a shock.
Yes.
I mean, and the new cabinet. Do you have any thoughts about?
Which she warned us, didn't she, that she's going to govern as a Conservative, and everyone went absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I think she may be. They tend to campaign in poetry and govern in prose, and I was slightly concerned by her appointments to education and to culture, in which those are two fairly safe pairs of hands who aren't going to rock the boat.
Yes.
Whereas Kemi Badenoch in either role, I think, would have been more of a culture warrior.
Yes.
Yeah, I actually feel that Liz Truss did actually campaign in prose. I mean, it was fairly prosaic stuff, wasn't it? I agree with you. Kemi Badenoch should have been culture secretary, and also, in terms of prose poetry thing, did you notice when Boris made that incredible speech about the Queen, didn't you feel that he felt like the actual Prime Minister and Liz Truss was sort of somewhere in there on the side?
Yeah, no, she and her tribute to the Queen, which apparently she composed herself, sort of on the back of an envelope in about 15 minutes, I thought wasn't fantastic compared to Boris's. Though Boris apparently had been working on his for about a year.
Yeah,
right.
And was evidently hoping to do it from the front of the House of Commons and not from the back benches, but he still, I thought, did it very well.
But Boris does prepare things a lot. I mean, it wasn't with Brexit, didn't he write 2 articles, which one went way?
Supposedly, that was always cited as an example of his superficiality. He couldn't quite make up his mind. He just wanted to do whatever the most popular thing was, which
I see.
make it more likely that he'd become leader.
Yeah, he is a great writer and speaker, but of course it doesn't necessarily translate to actual competence, as we've seen. So maybe that's where Truss will be
Maybe
stronger.
the reverse with Liz Truss.
Well, moving on now to Friday's Guardian. They give us a story about a billionaire donating his wealth to fight climate change. Toby.
So, this is the founder of Patagonia.
Yes, I have a Patagonia coat.
You got a Patagonia?
Yeah, very good.
I have to say, I'm not sure I can afford Patagonia. Patagonia, I remember when I lived in New York, was known as Patagucci because it was so expensive.
Well, they're very warm, I mean, I suppose that's the point.
Yeah, no, and I think it's been kind of fairly trendy now for several decades, which I think is one of the reasons the owner has become a billionaire. But he says he was shocked to read in Forbes that he was a billionaire now. He doesn't feel like a billionaire. And so just to underline that lack of feeling, he's going to give all his money away. He's going to give the company away. He's going to devote it to saving the planet. He says, and this is a quote, "Instead of going public, you could say we're going purpose." I think he might need some lessons in how to write there from Therese Kofi. But
So can you explain this to me, Nick? He's effectively saying that all profits from now on that his company generates are going straight, directly, to the climate. Is that right?
To our mission to save our home planet, Andrew.
Right.
You need to get it right. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it is a pity, isn't it, that he's given away his entire company for something that probably isn't even happening. I mean, as a climate denier, I had to just get that point in there.
I thought you would. But I mean...
especially you can afford these coat signs. I have a sort of off-brand fleece. So we're in very different...
I also have a lot
that's
of...
because he's essentially a metropolitan lib as well, right?
Well, yeah, Andrew's got a new book out. It's doing very well. So.
Yeah, but I've also got stuff from Georgia Asda as well, so don't worry about that. Look, but this is an interesting... Look, whatever you think about the climate change issue, it is quite a philanthropic gesture, isn't it, Toby? I mean, it's quite impressive because he is giving up a major source of revenue. You've got to admire his commitment to his principles.
He is 83, so perhaps he thought he didn't have too much longer to enjoy it, and he thought it might ruin his children if he was to give it all to them. So instead, he's giving it to the polar bears. And,
OK.
Let's hope they appreciate it.
OK, fair enough. Good on the polar bears. We're going to stick with The Guardian now. Bad news for the Bible Belt if this study into the future of America is to be believed. Nick, what's this?
Yes, terrible if true. Christians in the US could be a minority group by 2070, study finds. It's a little bit too complicated to go into on air because it's the Pew Research Centre, but then they've got 4 hypothetical scenarios. And in all of them, Christianity declines to various degrees.
How do they possibly predict this kind of thing?
It's based on, so I can tell you if you want, it's based on whether Christians switch to other religions, or whether they cease to be Christians and things like this. So they model the scenario based on if it continues at the current trend, if this many move away from the religion.
But you can never know, can you? You can never know whether
Correct.
Christianity will have a resurgence, it will become fashionable again, or people will... What do you think, Toby?
You know, I think the projection is based on the fact that the younger people are in America, the less likely they are to be Christians. So the theory is that as older people die out, so there'll be fewer and fewer Christians as a percentage of the population. But as you say, it might be that some people become Christians as they get older.
Well, that often happens. I mean, but here it's talking specifically about the rise of what they call nuns, and I think of nuns as in Catholic nuns. That's not what they mean. They mean nun as in having no religion.
Yeah, they're making a witty pun there, I think.
Well, it's going up from between 34% and 52% of the population. This is a population where if you are an atheist, you don't have a hope in hell of becoming the president. So this is interesting, isn't it, Nick?
Yeah, that is. It's also... to answer the earlier thing as well, it's as if switching among young Americans continued at recent rates, because you were asking how they figure this out.
Yes.
They say if it continues at that rate, in 2070, 46% of Americans would identify as Christian, making Christianity a plurality, the most common religious identity, but no longer a majority. And so...
Does it matter, though, ultimately? I mean, they have separation of church and state.
It does matter, but what I wondered is, as well, how they incorporate the fact that what if you're a Christian but you don't want to go to the church because it's a bit woke or it makes you wear a mask? I mean, does it incorporate people who are Christians at home? And as you say, I think more and more young people will turn to Christianity in our sort of culture that completely lacks meaning, and so it can't incorporate that either.
I think the reason it matters is because, as people cease to believe in God, they don't just believe in nothing. They don't become kind of, secular humanists and more gentle and less likely to fight and all the rest of it. As G.K. Chesterton said, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything.
Can I just say quickly, that was apocryphal. Actually, he didn't, but it is a very good quote.
OK, thank you.
Sorry.
Who did say it then?
It was
no one knows.
It was probably Mark Twain. Most things are Mark Twain.
OK, maybe it was Mark Twain.
I
I think the worry is that as this bulwark against various forms of kind of mass hysteria declines, so, all kinds of things might emerge to fill that bottle, just as woke has, I think.
Well, I mean, woke has filled that, but, you've also seen woke infect churches. I mean, I even spoke to an evangelical Baptist American who said that it's even in the Baptist church. They're having now sessions on intersectional readings of the Bible and things like that. That's a surprise.
Yeah, and I think the reason for that is that a lot of church leaders believe that their way of making the church relevant again and filling the pews is to embrace aspects of woke. They see a kind of a yearning for moral purpose and meaning amongst secular populations. I think, well, we can feed that hunger, that God-shaped hole. And my worry is that Prince Charles will think along the same lines and think the way to make the royal family relevant again is to embrace various aspects of the woke cult. I hope not, but I fear he might. That's
my concern, because he did reassert his allegiance to the Church of England as the head of the Church of England, but also, yes, the Church of England is quite woke now. And what we have now is a lot of people who call themselves cultural Christians, but they don't want to be actual Christians because of the wokeness of the churches. OK, the Times next, and Harry is delaying his book, but apparently it might mean more chapters, Toby. Yes, Harry's memoir, his much-anticipated memoir, was due to be published originally later this year, but it's now been delayed until next year. The reason for this is because of the death of the Queen. He doesn't want to be, I guess, seen to be cashing in on international interest in the royal family as a result of her death. It's more dignified to leave a year or so before publishing his book. But my theory is that he's actually, because other members of the royal family, in particular William and Charles, now know they're going to be in his book, he's delayed publication in the hope that he can, get a few more concessions out of them, maybe an HRH for his and Meghan's children, not just royal titles. You mean leverage? Well, if they know they're going to be in his book and the book's coming out and it's going to cause an international sensation, he's going to be on Oprah promoting it, you'd think they'd tread a bit more carefully than if he's already written it and it comes out later this year and there's nothing they can do about it. Could it be that he's now thinking he needs to be a bit more sensitive and actually what he's doing is taking the time to rewrite it? I mean, this was advertised as a tell-all memoir, devastating for the royal family, devastating for the Queen.
But maybe he's thinking that would be insensitive now.
You know what I think is really going on? And you will probably sympathise with this as a fellow book writer, Andrew. He probably just hasn't written a word yet.
Maybe he hasn't done it.
He's a deadline surfer.
He must have ghostwriters.
Like Boris, hasn't written his book on Shakespeare.
He must have.
I reckon that's what's really.
He must have ghostwriters.
He does
right?
have a ghostwriter. Yeah, he's
must
referred to in this article actually.
What do you think, Nick?
Well, I wondered, yes, there'll be these hastily written extra chapters. Now, will they be dedicated to how people were mean to him around the funeral and because he held hands with Meghan and he wants to get those extra details in? Or will it be much more respectful and he'll be editing out the more nasty bits in light of events? But I also like Toby's idea that it's this kind of just sort of Damocles hanging over this kind of just blackmail tool. Maybe there is no book, it just exists constantly.
It's constantly going to be delayed by 1 year, as he negotiates for more and more privileges.
He ends up king before it comes out. Yeah.
Well, OK, well, this next story is actually related to this. This is The Sun, and this is apparently Harry and Meghan are furious that their children won't be getting the HRH titles, Nick.
Yes, they're furious they won't get HRH, but they'll still be called Prince and Princess because they sort of negotiated for that. And I think Dan Wootton covered this a lot earlier. The question is, why should they get any titles, really? I feel a little bit bad because they didn't choose to leave the royal family. So what if you are the children and one day you would have wanted to be, it's a sort of impossible hypothetical, but you might have liked to be part of the royal family. Now you're out of it. So in that case, it is unfair in a sense.
But why do they want their children to have this?
Yes, that's the thing, isn't it? That is the strange paradox. Why do they want it when they've spent all the time criticising the royal family, trying to get out of it? They still want the kind of, as my guess would be, they still want the kind of Disney version of it, so they can go around America sort of selling their image as still in the royal family.
Is it as cynical as that, Toby?
I think, well, the cynical take, which is my take...
Yeah, surprise, surprise.
The reason Harry and Meghan have put a distance between themselves and the royal family and renounced their roles in the royal family and moved to America is because they wanted to leverage the brand. They wanted to try and make as much money from their royal status as they possibly could. And the royal household said, well, no, you've got to choose. If you decide to make a Netflix reality show, you can no longer be HRH. Your children can't be HRH, etc.
Yes.
And I don't think they didn't like that, but they chose to go the commercial route. So this is their bed, they should lie in it.
Can it be true that they've been negotiating for this or sort of pitching for this week of all times? I mean, and it does seem a bit odd. I mean, so apparently it's Charles that has allowed the children to be prince and princess. But why should that be the case? I mean, Edward's children aren't prince and princess, Louise and James.
Yeah, I don't know if they've actually been negotiating for it, and it just strikes me that any claims might be libelous, so I'll just say that was all satire, and I don't know, because, Meghan, if she needs money, you can imagine it.
Yeah, I take that.
She's not going to sue you, Nick.
That was pure speculation.
What's she going to get?
Here's the bit about the fleece from earlier. But...
Well, exactly. Daily Mail now, and the queue to see the Queen is so long, mourners are being directed to California, Nick.
Yeah, mourners hoping to join back of queue to see Queen lying in state, directed to California and North Carolina, due to an error on the live tracker, which was from 3 words location code. So basically,
what is this, by the way?
Yeah, I'll explain. Someone sent me a YouTube link to it earlier. There's all these trackers that are tracking the queue and so on, and this comes from the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. But the key part to me is it says sources at DCMS said the errors were caused by civil servants manually typing out the codes. So it's the woke civil service again. So they've published the wrong postcodes. And it's meant to be automatic, but they've typed them in manually. So it's suddenly sending people to America rather than the back of a very long queue. It's a very long queue, but it's not quite that long.
Is that because they're all working from home and they're having to kind of flick through A to Z?
They didn't listen to Jacob Rees-Mogg and they're just at home.
Right.
Why didn't they just use maps? What's wrong with a good old-fashioned map?
See, I like that. You are getting more reaction.
I am, because I'm hanging around with you all the time, Nick. This is the problem.
Let's go back to horses, compasses, maps.
Yeah. Any thoughts on this, Toby, in particular?
Not really, no.
That's a fair response.
Excited by that one, sorry.
We're going to move on to Friday's Independent. It looks like the Queen was a massive fan of the BBC quiz show Pointless. Nick, doesn't surprise me, because it's a good show.
Me again, yeah. Queen Elizabeth II was very competitive as well during the Pointless game. So Alexander Armstrong, the host, of course, was invited to Sandringham, and there was 2 teams. One was the Queen as captain versus a local woman, and apparently the Queen was very competitive and very funny. We know she's very funny. We saw in the video last night with the horse, but she was really into Pointless. Again, it does seem very British of her, and it just seems just perfect for the Queen again that she was funny, competitive, and into pointless quizzes.
This wasn't a televised Pointless.
No, it was a sort of unofficial one, and Osmond was annoyed that he didn't get to go. I feel like it was a sort of private one that the Queen basically sort of rigged in her favour. I'm not suggesting she did, but it was at her home. She was the captain. Osmond
Sounds like fun.
It was an unofficial one. It doesn't say if she won, though, does it? But she probably did.
I was the only thing I've ever been on telly that anyone ever comes up to me, you know, total strangers in public, and says, "Didn't I see you on Pointless?"
You were on Pointless,
I was actually on Celebrity Pointless, so I have to say to these nice, charming members of the public, "Didn't I see you on Pointless?" I said, "No, you saw me on Celebrity Pointless."
Yeah, you should correct them.
Got to correct them.
Well, we have got time, I think, just for one more story, and that's the Daily Mail. And I guess the Queen should have had a sign saying, "Beware the dog," on her Balmoral estate, Toby.
Yes, so apparently the Queen's beloved corgis, who everyone imagines were her constant companions through life, these charming lap dogs,
yes.
Always friendly, would come and lick whoever came to visit her, and would always break the ice by being fed in front of them, and so on and so forth. Turns out they weren't so cuddly after all. According to this story in the Daily Mail, they bit a variety of guests. On many occasions, they bit the Queen herself.
Really?
Who was once forced to get 3 stitches.
Isn't that treason?
Story.
To bite the Queen?
You'd think a dog would be put in the tower for biting the Queen,
Yeah.
But, there was even a call for the royal staff to put up a "Beware of the dog" sign at Balmoral after one of the corgis reportedly bit the postman.
Goodness me, Nick, that's terrible behaviour.
Yes, I know. It might be why they bred those Dorgies, which were a mixture with the Dachshunds. Maybe they were less violent. I do think the Mail are perhaps struggling a little bit with the amount of coverage they've had to do on the Queen. When they wrote here, corgis have 4 short legs, a long snout and 2 huge pointed ears. They're at the point of describing dogs now.
They're describing corgis. I did have a couple of corgis on the show on Sunday, and they're interesting little dogs. I mean, I was told that they're actually trained to bite the heels of cattle. But there we go. Anyway, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to my guests, Toby Young and Nick Dixon. And Headliners will be back tomorrow at 11 with Mark Dolan. Good night.
It is day 2 of the lying in state of Queen Elizabeth II. And within 100 yards of this building, behind that window, you can see the crowd.